Dear learners, today we shall discuss the module 12, that is Indigenous and Local Histories. Within this module, today we will discuss the unit number 1, that is Representation in Heritage Tourism. We have already learned what is heritage tourism, that is refer to the travel undertaken with the intention of experiencing places, artifacts and activities that authentically represent the stories and people of the past and present. It includes visits to monuments, archaeological sites, museums, memorials, historic cities, cultural landscapes, sacred spaces, festivals, and even living indigenous settlements. International bodies such as UNESCO recognize both tangible heritage and intangible heritage as vital component of humanity's shared cultural legacy. However, heritage tourism is not merely about preserving and displaying the past. It is also about interpretation, the way history is selected, framed, narrated, and presented to visitors. Representation is never neutral. Decisions about what to include, what to exclude, and how to describe communities are influenced by power relations, political agendas, economic goals, and historical legacies. Tourism boards may highlight colorful festivals while ignoring histories of displacement. Museums may celebrate artistic achievement while remaining silent about colonial exploitations. Thus, heritage tourism often reflects dominant narratives rather than the lived realities of local communities. In many parts of the world, including India, indigenous communities possess deep-rooted connections to land, forests, rivers, and sacred landscapes. These histories are preserved through oral traditions, myth of origin, songs, rituals, customary laws, and ecological practices passed down across generations. For instance, in regions such as Nagaland and Meghalaya, community festivals, clan genealogies, and traditional institutions continue to serve as repositories of collective memory. These histories emphasizes community relationship, environmental balance, and spiritual beliefs rather than written records or state-centered narratives. Yet, historically, indigenous and local histories have often been documented and interpreted by outsiders, mostly their colonial administrators, missionaries, anthropologists, or later tourism planners and government agencies. During the colonial period, indigenous communities were frequently described in hierarchical or stereotyped terms, shaping perceptions that still influence tourism marketing today. Even in post-colonial contexts, state-led tourism initiatives may simplify complex initiatives into easily consumable images for visitors. As a result, indigenous cultures may be romanticized as timeless or primitive or commodified into stage performances for tourist consumptions. This unit therefore critically examines the representation of indigenous and local histories within heritage tourism. It explores key questions such as who has the authority to tell history, whose voice is heard in tourism narratives, how are power and identity negotiated through interpretations. Can tourism become a platform for empowerment rather than exploitation? By analyzing these issues, the unit encourages learners to move beyond surface level appreciations of cultural diversity and to engage critically with the policies of heritage representations. After studying this unit, you will be able to define indigenous and local histories in the context of heritage tourism, understand how representation shapes tourist perceptions, analyze issues of power, identity, and authenticity, Then examine the impact of commodification of indigenous cultures, such as ethical and inclusive approaches to heritage interpretations. Now we shall discuss the indigenous histories. Indigenous histories refers to the collective memories, cultural traditions, social institutions, and historical experiences of native communities who maintain a deep ancestral and spiritual connections to their land. These histories are not merely records of past events, even represent living systems of knowledge that shape identity, worldwide, and community relationship. Unlike conventional historical writings, which often relies heavily on written documents, that state archives, indigenous histories are preserved and transmitted to alternative forms of knowledge. One of the most distinctive features of indigenous histories is that they are oral rather than written. Histories of origin, migration, resistance, and survival are passed down through generations by elders, storytellers, and community leaders. Oral traditions are not simply narratives, they are structured way of remembering and interpreting the past. Through repetition and ritual performance, historical knowledge is kept alive within the community. Indigenous histories are also embedded in rituals, songs, dances, myths, and material culture. Ceremonies often commemorate ancestral events or reinforce collective memory. Songs may recount heroic deeds or ecological wisdom. Myths may explain the origin of rivers, mountains, or clans. These cultural expressions function as historical archives even though they may not resemble conventional written history. Another defining characteristic is their close relationship with environment and spirituality. For many indigenous communities, land is not merely a resource but a sacred entity connected ancestors and cosmology. Forests, rivers, and mountains may hold spiritual significance and historical meaning. Ecological practices such as shifting cultivation, water conservation, or sacred groves are deeply intertwined with historical memory and identity. Furthermore, indigenous histories are typically community centered rather than state centered. Instead of focusing on kings, empires, or national boundaries, they emphasize clan lineage, village institutions, customary laws, and collective experiences. Leadership structures, kingship systems, and communal decisions making process form an integral part of their historical narratives. For example, the San people of Southern Africa preserved their past through storytelling traditions, and ancient rock art, which serves as visual and narrative records of their cosmology and way of life. Today, these rock art sites have become important heritage tourism attractions. Though debates continue about how they should be interpreted and who control their representations. In Northeast India, communities such as Khasi people and Naga people maintain rich oral genealogies, customary laws, and vibrant festivals that reflect their historical evolution. Clan based memory, traditional councils, and seasonal rituals act as mechanism of preserving and transforming historical knowledge across generations. Then, what is local histories? Local histories, while related to indigenous histories, focus more broadly on the lived experiences of specific villages, towns, districts, or regions. They examine how ordinary people shape and experience history at the grassroots level. Unlike national histories, which often highlight major political events, rulers, and wars, local histories concentrate on everyday life and community level transformations. Local histories include folk traditions, oral narratives, proverbs, and legends that reflect the cultural and historical identity of a region. They may document local resistance movements such as peasant uprisings, anti colonial struggles, or social reform movements that do not always receive prominence in national textbooks. These histories often celebrate regional heroes, community leaders, and reformers who played important roles in shaping their local society. Additionally, local histories record everyday social and cultural practices, including agricultural cycles, craft traditions, market systems, marriage customs, and community festivals. Such practices reveal how social relations, gender roles, caste dynamics, and economic structures evolve over time within specific local contexts. An important feature of local histories is that they often challenge dominant national narratives. National history may present a unified, centralized account of the past, whereas local histories highlight diversity, conflict, and alternative perspectives. They bring attention to marginalized voices, subaltern experiences, and regional variations that complicate simplified historical narratives. In the context of heritage tourism, both indigenous and local histories play a crucial role in shaping cultural experiences. However, when these histories are packaged for tourism, there is a risk of oversimplification or selective representation. Therefore, understanding the depth, diversity, and community centered nature of indigenous and local histories is essential for developing ethical and inclusive heritage interpretations. Now, moving to the modes of representation in heritage tourism. Representation in heritage tourism is not a simple act of showcasing culture. It involves selecting, interpreting, and presenting particular images of communities to visitors. These representations influence how tourists understand indigenous and local societies. Often they reflect broader political, economic, and historical forces rather than the lived realities of the communities themselves. These are major modes through which indigenous and local histories are represented in heritage tourism. First one is romanticization and exoticization. One of the most common mode of representation is romanticization and exoticization. Indigenous communities are frequently portrayed as primitive, simple, close to nature, or untouched by modernity. Tourism advertisements often highlight colorful costumes, traditional dances, handicrafts, and rituals while neglecting to mention contemporary aspects of life such as higher education, professional careers, digital engagement, political activism, and urban migrations. This portrayal creates aesthetic and nostalgic image of indigenous life. Communities are presented as if they exist outside of time, unchanged for centuries. Such selective representation ignores the dynamic nature of culture and the fact that indigenous societies continuously adapt to social, economic, and technological changes. Romanticization also transforms cultural differences into spectacle. Cultural practices that hold deep spiritual or social meaning may be simplified into entertainment for visitors. The emphasis is placed on what appears visually striking or different, rather than on historical complexity or social realities. As a result, communities may feel pressure to perform an identity that matches tourist expectations rather than their authentic everyday experiences. This process ultimately freezes indigenous groups into a timeless past, denying them recognition as modern citizens participating actively in national and global processes. Then, colonial narratives. Another important mode of representation stems from colonial era description of indigenous people. During colonial rule, administrators and anthropologists often categorized tribal communities as backward, savage, or uncivilized. These classifications were used to justify colonial control and intervention. In colonial India, for example, ethnographic surveys and administrative records categorized tribes hierarchically and portrayed them as isolated from mainstream society. These representations shaped long lasting stereotypes. Even in post colonial tourism narratives, traces of such language sometimes remain visible. Brochures may describe communities as primitive tribes or ancient forest dwellers, unconsciously echoing colonial vocabulary. Colonial narratives also emphasize the idea that indigenous communities needed guidance, development, or protections from the modern world. When tourism materials reproduce such assumptions, they reinforce unequal power relations between the observer, that is the tourist, and the observed, that is the community. Instead of presenting indigenous people as historical agents with complex political histories, they are depicted as passive subjects of curiosity. Next one is museum and display practices. Museums play a crucial role in shaping public understanding of indigenous histories. Traditionally, museums collected artifacts such as tools, costumes, ornaments, weapons, and ritual objects and displayed them as a specimen of a vanishing culture. These objects were often removed from their original context and exhibited with minimal explanation of their cultural significance. Sacred objects, ceremonial masks, or ritual instruments may be displayed purely as artistic or ethnographic items without reference to their spiritual meaning or community ownership. This documentalization reduces living traditions of static displays behind glass cases. However, museum practices are gradually changing. Many institutions now adopt collaborative curation where indigenous communities participate in designing exhibitions, writing labels, and describing how objects should be displayed. Some museums have initiated reputation efforts returning sacred objects to their communities of origin. These initiatives aim to transform museums from colonial repositories into spaces of dialogue and shared authority. Even so, debates continue about ownership, representation, and the ethics of displaying indigenous heritage. Then, stage authenticity. The concept of stage authenticity, introduced by tourism scholars, refer to the modifications of cultural practices to suit tourist expectations. In heritage tourism settings, performances may be adjusted in terms of duration, format, or content to fit travel schedules or audience preferences. For example, rituals that traditionally last several hours or days may be shortened to 30 minutes performance. Sacred ceremonies might be adapted into cultural shows for entertainment. Costumes may be standardized or exaggerated to appear more traditional to outsiders. While such staging can generate income and promote cultural visibility, it raises important questions. Does modifications dilute cultural meaning? Who decides which element can be altered? Are communities voluntarily adapting it, or are they responding to economic pressure? It is important to recognize that culture is not static. Adaptation has always been part of cultural evolution. However, when changes are driven primarily by external tourist expectations rather than internal community dynamics, authenticity became contested. Then power, voice, and identity. Representation in heritage tourism is deeply intertwined with questions of power, authenticity, and identity. Heritage sites are not simply neutral spaces where history is displayed. They are arenas where different groups negotiate meaning, memory, and recognition. The way indigenous and local histories are interpreted depends largely on who controls the narrative and whose perspective is prioritized. At the core of this discussion, there are three fundamental questions. Who tells the story? Who benefits economically? Then whose voice is missing? These questions highlight the unequal power structures that often shape heritage tourism. Now, who tells the story? In many heritage tourism contexts, interpretation is controlled by state agencies, tourism departments, private tour operators, or external scholars. Guidebooks, museum labels, promotional materials, and official websites frequently present a version of history constructed by institutions rather than by the communities themselves. When outsiders dominate the narratives, indigenous histories may be filtered through academic, administrative, or commercial lenses. Complex histories of resistance, displacement, or marginalization may be downplayed in favor of colorful festivals and picturesque lifestyles. The authority to define culture thus became concentrated in the hands of those with institutional or economic power. The critique displayed by the subaltern group emphasized that mainstream historiography in South Asia often excluded the voices of peasants, tribal communities, women, and other marginalized groups. These subaltern groups were rarely portrayed as active agents in history. Similarly, in heritage tourism, indigenous communities may be visible as performers or craft producers, but invisible as decision makers or interpreters of their own past. Now, who benefits economically? Heritage tourism generates significant revenue. However, economic benefits are not always distributed equally. In some cases, tour operators, urban investors, or government agencies capture the majority of profit, while local communities receive only limited financial returns. This imbalance reinforces existing inequalities. If communities do not share in the economic gains of tourism, they may have little control over how their culture is represented. Economic dependence on tourism can also pressure communities to conform to market expectations, even if those expectations distort their identity. Empowerment occurs within indigenous groups, manage tourism initiatives, operate homestays, guide tours, and participate in policy decisions. Economic participation strengthens cultural autonomy and ensures that representation reflects community perspectives. The next one is whose voice is missing. The absence of certain voices is often more revealing than what is explicitly presented. Women, elders, youth, and minority clans within indigenous communities may not all have equal opportunities to shape representation. Similarly, histories of conflict, long struggles, or societal changes may be omitted because they are politically sensitive or considered unattractive to tourists. When certain narratives are excluded, heritage tourism produces a simplified and sanitized version of identity. Culture becomes reduced to symbols, customs, dances, artifacts, while deeper social realities remain invisible. Identity and the risk of simplification. Identity is dynamic, negotiated, and multi-layered. Indigenous communities are not frozen in the past. They are modern, politically aware, and socially diverse. However, when interpretation is extremely controlled, identity may be simplified into single stereotype: the traditional tribal, the eco-friendly native, or the exotic performers. Such simplifications can have long term consequences. It may influence how the broader society perceives indigenous communities and how communities perceive themselves. When external narratives dominate, communities may internalize, impose identities, or feel compelled to perform a particular version of tradition. Now, towards inclusive representation. Addressing issues of power, voice, and identity requires participatory approaches to heritage tourism. This includes community involvement in planning and interpretation, inclusion of multiple perspectives within the community, recognition of historical injustice, and contemporary challenges. When indigenous communities gain interpretative authority, heritage tourism can move from being a site of domination to a platform for empowerment. Instead of reinforcing unequal power structure, it can support cultural dignity, self-representation, and assertion of identity on their own terms. Then commodification of indigenous culture. Commodification of indigenous cultures refers to the process by which cultural expressions, traditions, rituals, symbols, and way of life are transformed into marketable products for tourism consumption. In this process, elements of culture that once held social, spiritual, or communal significance are repackaged and sold within a commercial framework. While this transformation can create economic opportunities, it also raises important ethical and cultural concerns. In the context of heritage tourism, commodification often occurs when cultural practices are adapted to meet tourist expectations and market demands. Traditions became attractions, rituals became performances, and community spaces became commercial sites. Then forms of commodification. One of the common example is the sale of traditional handicrafts primarily for tourist markets. Indigenous artisans may produce textiles, jewelry, pottery, wood carving, or paintings that were once created for domestic or ritual use. While selling crafts can provide valuable income and help sustain artistic skills, designs may be modified to suit tourist preferences. Cheaper material or simplified patterns may be replaced traditional forms in order to increase production and affordability. A further instance is the branding of villages as heritage village or tribal village. Entire communities may be marketed as living museums where tourists can observe authentic traditional life. While this branding can attract visitors and generate employment, it may also reduce complex societies to simplified images. Villagers may feel pressure to maintain a particular traditional appearance even if their lifestyle has evolved. It is important to recognize this commodification is not entirely negative. Tourism can generate income and employment, receive declining craft traditions, encourage younger generations to value cultural heritage, promote cultural visibility and pride. In some cases, indigenous communities actively use tourism markets to strengthen cultural identity and achieve economic self-reliance. When communities have control over productions and pricing, commodification can become a strategy of empowerment. Now moving to the risks and challenges. However, excessive or extremely controlled commodification carries serious risks. Loss of cultural meaning. When rituals or symbols removed from their original context, their deeper significance may be diluted. Sacred practices may lose spiritual depth if performed repeatedly for commercial audiences. Then, standardization of traditions. Tourism often demands uniformity. As a result, diverse cultural expressions may be standardized into fixed formats. Costumes, dance, and performances may be simplified into a single representative version, ignoring regional or clan variations. Internal community tensions. Not all community members may agree on what aspects of culture should be saved publicly. Elders may resist commercialization of sacred knowledge, while younger members may view tourism as an economic necessity. Disagreement over profit distribution can also create conflict within communities. Then, cultural dependency on market demand. When cultural survival became tied to tourist demand, traditions may evolve according to market trends rather than community values. This dependency can undermine cultural autonomy. Now, towards balance and ethical tourism. Balanced heritage tourism recognizes that culture is not merely a commodity but a living system of value and relationship. Ethical approaches require community consent before presenting cultural practices, respect for sacred and restricted knowledge, fair distribution of economic benefits, flexibility that allows communities to adapt traditions on their own terms. Most importantly, indigenous communities should have the authority to decide which aspect of the culture they wish to share and which should remain private. When communities control representation and economic participation, commodification can be managed in ways that preserve dignity and cultural meaning. Now we are going to conclude this session. The representation of indigenous and local histories in heritage tourism is a dynamic and political process. While tourism can promote cultural visibility and economic development, it can also reinforce stereotypes and commodify traditions. Ethical heritage tourism requires inclusive participation, contextual interpretations, and respect for community autonomy. When indigenous voices lead the narrative, tourism became a tool for empowerment rather than exploitation. Thank you very much.